Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all feeling refreshed after your coffees. We're about to start the second part of the seminar. My name is Walter Train, and I'm going to be introducing this iconic man to the left of me. So, designing great builds means careful consideration of each space inside a structure and the quality of what goes into that space. Supporting the expertise it takes to ensure quality choices, Flush Bathrooms is the sponsor of this seminar, and by a master of recognizing quality, Robert Silke. So walking through the city, each building has a story it tells as you pass it by, from old brutalist structures to shiny modern skyscrapers. They all have something to say, but there's a select few that emerge a cut above the rest. Unmissable and unforgettable. What makes these buildings so unique or special or distinct, you might ask? Well, the fact that it's got Silke signature on it can tell you everything. Robert Silke is an industry figure that graces the streets with designs that speak for themselves. But achieving this type of signature is definitely no small feat. With a career filled with showstoppers, Robert knows how to leave his mark and has joined us today to share a few tricks of the trade. So may I ask that you all give a warm welcome for Robert Silke. Thank you.
That is super kind. Thank you. I mean, this is an amazing crowd. Wasn't expecting this amazing event, and I heard a little bit about the panel discussion before the break, and it's just amazing to hear these kinds of debates happening, that there's once again a forum for this kind of discussion. You know, I almost never go to conferences because there's nothing like this, so thanks to SCAPE for organizing something that's really looking worthwhile. I mean, everyone is here today, and thank you to Flush for making this possible. The topic that I have been set today by the organizers, and I just want to make this clear where it comes from, is reactive architecture. So is there anybody here who knows what reactive architecture is? Any hands? This is audience participation. Has anyone here ever heard the term reactive architecture before? Yeah, I hadn't either. I hadn't either. But I'm an expert on on that. Having done a little bit of Google on it, it's actually a term from like IT and programming, where you speak about reactive systems architecture, and it's basically like a responsive kind of programming, a kind of an AI, a dynamic kind of programming architecture. Anyway, that's as far as the term doesn't really exist in architecture. You could call it dynamic, responsive architecture. I thought maybe it meant we were getting at reactionary architecture, which is a thing. You know, reactionary is like it's kind of a right-wing political position to take, a conservative position. Like if there's been a left-wing socialist revolution that's taken place, the forces of the old conservatives who fight back, they are known as the reactionaries. So if the commander-in-chief, Julius Malema, would call you a reactionary, he would be calling you an anti-revolutionary. And look, I suppose you could say that like historicist postmodernism, you know, a return to pediments and gables after modernism could be regarded as a kind of a reactionary architecture. But this whole notion of politics and architecture, you know, this idea that certain kinds of buildings can be fascist and certain kinds of buildings can be socialist, I think it's largely been debunked by Jonathan Meades, who's this very, very famous British culturist, architectural theorist, also food theorist, he wrote of Le Corbusier, who, you know, there's accusations that Le Corbusier was he was actually a fascist because he was a member of several fascist parties in France, and there's allegations he was an anti-Semite, and that the architecture was essentially fascist. Anyway, in debunking this, Meads wrote in The Spectator that Le Corbusier was an architect, and thus Le Corbusier was a promiscuous tart, because it goes with the job, and an intrinsic facet of servility, which is what architects are. We serve. An intrinsic facet of servility is to flatter whomever it is that holds the purse strings by professing to share his convictions. Okay? So he concludes in saying, show me an architect who genuinely believes in this doctrine or that doctrine, left-wing, right-wing, fascism, socialism. Show me an architect who genuinely believes in this or that doctrine to the exclusion of all others, and I will show you a low-waged specialist in loft conversions, a high-minded purist who would never betray his principles. Because architects, we are in service. We don't get paid for principles. We get paid for making the unacceptable acceptable. That was Gore Vidal on commercial art. Was that the commercial artist is one who is able to make acceptable that which maybe should not have ever been made at all. That is the role of the commercial artist, and in many ways the role of the commercial architect, and I would even posit that it is the way of all architects, because any architect who thinks they're a fine artist is doing those loft conversions, okay? It's not a fine art, it's an applied art, and the sooner we get used to that, I think the better. That we are not the mother of all arts, maybe we are the mother of all crafts, and whereas art has to be so original, fine art, that nobody dare ever copy it, a good craft, if it's really, really good, is something that everybody should copy. That's the defining difference. And I posit today that architecture could be the greatest of the crafts, but it's certainly not even the smallest of the fine arts. And essentially, I'm here today to talk about the future and to talk about futurism. Broadly speaking, to a man on horseback, our work has an Art Deco-ish feel, or a neo-Art Deco-ish feel, or could be regarded as a reactionary movement to modernism, in that we are going back and ploughing old decorative styles to make new buildings. But none of these buildings, and this is Tuinhuis, are actually Art Deco, but I mean, if you've seen the amount of junk furniture on Facebook Marketplace being sold as Art Deco, people don't know what Art Deco is. So we're probably more aligned with the futurist movement. And I want to talk about the evolution of design and development in the built environment in Cape Town over the last couple of years, using the work of our practice as a kind of a parallel to where the city has been going, and also using the future work of our practice as an indication as to where the city might be going in the future. So this is a slide, and there's quite a few people here from my own graduating class, because I am Cape Town's oldest young architect, but there are a couple of others here from our year, and all of you will recall when Professor Joe Noero, probably one of the greatest architects alive today in Cape Town, he started off his inaugural lecture with us when we were in 5th year in 2000 with this slide, which was thought to have been put together by an advertising agency in the 1920s as a vision of what the future of Cape Town would be, but that's not true. This slide is the set from Interster, which is an SABC show, the answer to that British puppet sci-fi series, not the Avengers, I forget the exact name of it, but we couldn't get it because of sanctions, so SABC had such funding in 1980 that it could make its own. And this is the set to Interster, okay? It was built physically somewhere in SABC archives in Pretoria, you will still find this set, Gathering Dust. And it is one of the most stunning visualizations for some kind of a Hong Kong future for Cape Town, because in Interstar, which was set probably round about now, I think it was round about, you know, in 1980, this is what Cape Town was going to be in the year 2023. The apartheid government had mastered space travel. There they are. That's what a spaceman and woman would look like in the year 2023 with the Oranje Blanje Blauw on the helmet. It's like a Pretoria bus. And in fact, they looked like Pretoria bus drivers, actually. I remember. So even in the 90s, all of the bus drivers in Pretoria were still white. So in the year 2023, Cape Town was the capital of the universe. South Africa had mastered space travel, had captured the universe. Cape Town was the capital of the universe, and all the aliens spoke Afrikaans, okay? But, and you could see there were hovercraft flying down the Herengracht. And why I wanted to start with this image is because many people are horrified when they see this kind of Hong Kong future for Cape Town, because it conflicts with a certain conservative identity that we as Cape Townians have. There's a very strong attachment in Cape Town to the notion of little Cape Town, right? Cape Town is a city that still calls itself a town because we struggle. We've had a difficult adolescence in the apartheid era, and Cape Town is not this Victorian city anymore. So this is Ford's visualization called Cape Town in the year 2000, right? And this was done in the late 1800s, at the end of the Victorian era, and this is what they thought Cape Town would be right now, right? And it certainly, that does not reflect the Herengracht, but I suppose if you went into the waterfront, you would find some kind of a realization of this Victorian vision for Cape Town. And you could say that the predominant discourse, certainly among privileged Cape Townians, is that this is what's desirable. And of course, it's a kind of conservatism which suggests that Cape Town is so good that you don't want to change a thing, right? That it is so perfect. But Cape Town is not even what you see in this image. Cape Town's got a lot of problems, and there are some parts which are very, very nice, but I'd say 80% of Cape Town is still pretty dismal, and if you took the mountain away, you'd find it's architecturally quite bare, the city. You know, other South African cities, Joburg, Pretoria, are probably architecturally richer than Cape Town if you were to take away the mountain, flatten out the soil, and just have all things being equal. Cape Town hangs a lot on that mountain. In terms of So, I mean, obviously and so what Jono Ero was suggesting was that an equitable, just future for Cape Town, where everybody has a stake in the city centre and in the Atlantic seaboard and the good parts, is Cape Town's got to densify. That's not a controversial position anymore. All that's controversial today is nobody wants that densification to happen in their backyard. Right? So it must happen somewhere else. If you're in Seapoint, no, that must happen in town. And if you're in town, no, that must happen in Maitland. You know, nobody wants it where they are, but that's understandable. So in terms of interest in the future, Art Deco was a derivative of the futurist style of architecture, which is one of my guilty pleasures because futurism really was invented in fascist Italy under Mussolini. So you know, it's not all fascist architecture was great. You know, in Berlin, what Hitler was doing was bloody awful architecturally. You know, absolutely terrible taste in architecture. Whereas Mussolini, and I suppose this just goes with Italians, they produced some very, very interesting buildings during their fascist period, and they pioneered this kind of futurism. So to a man on horseback, oh, that looks like an Art Deco factory, but it's not. Art Deco is influenced by futurism. Futurism wasn't influenced by Art Deco. So these are some sketches of buildings and factories and a brave new future in Mussolini's Italy, which most of it never got built, right? But these were fantasies. And what's funny is that while in right-wing fascist Italy you had these industrial deco fantasies, in the Soviet Union, which was politically the entire diametrically opposite spectrum, you were also doing, it was called constructivist architecture. Obviously, they didn't have the money in the early days of the Soviet Union, and they struggled, but they were going in the same direction as the Italians. Totally different political system, same style of architecture. Constructivism, Italian futurism, they really are essentially interchangeable. As it happens, by the time the Soviet Union became economically successful, Stalin was in power, and Stalin had the same taste in architecture as Hitler, so he started building sort of neoclassical wedding cakes again, same as Speer did. These are some more images of Italian futurist buildings, and this is a 3D reconstruction of one of them, again, that was just never built. And this, of course, is one of the most famous Italian futurist buildings. It's in Africa. This is in Eritrea, in Asmara, the famous Fiat dealership. A lot of people think of this as an Art Deco treasure. Again, it's not Art Deco. It is Italian futurist, by the Italians, for the Italians, a Fiat dealership. And this really, it ties into like the golden age of petrol station design. Some of the great petrol station service stations that were done in the USA they came from this futurist school. And I dare say that today, is there any practice that survives that is still a futurist firm? Probably Zaha Hadid and Partners. I would say they are the last remaining high-profile heirs to the futurist movement. And I'd say the successors to Art Deco, in that it's decorative modern architecture. This, incidentally, speaking of Italian fascists, who recognizes this building? This is, if you've been to the Labia, you'll know Seafair House. Did anybody know that this was a custom-built embassy for Mussolini's fascists? This was the fascist embassy of Cape Town. Built in the 30s, of course, done in a more traditional style. But if you look closely at the moldings, you'll even see the fasci, the bunch of wheat. That was the logo of the fascist party. Fascist means fasci, a bunch of wheat, and the philosophy being that if the wheat is held together in a big bunch as a group, it will be strong and you can't break it. But on your own as an individual, as one strand of wheat, your spine will be snapped by the state, under the sheer force of the state, right? So that's what the fasci meant. And there are moldings on this building of the fasci. The Labias they had their villa next door where the cinema is, they of course donated their land for the fascist embassy, as one did in it was the 30s. Okay. And Cape Town had a couple of futurist buildings as well. So for a long period, Holyrood in Queen Victoria Street was my life and obsession. I lived in several studios that I'd carved together over the years. And this is probably Cape Town's first micro apartment block, built in 1938, opposite the Gardens. A block of 40 bachelor studios. Every flat was 35 square meters. The biggest flat was 35 square meters. The smallest flat was 30 square meters. They were tiny by the standards of the day, but they were modern, and they all faced the mountain. And guess what? They were built for Airbnb. Okay, it was constructed as holiday apartments. That's Ronnie Levitan took that picture in the 1980s, I think. That's Ronnie Levitan, also around about 1985. Ronnie liked to photograph buildings up their skirt. That was his thing. And you'll see, and people think of this an Art Deco treasure. It's more modern than Art Deco. It's a futurist building. This was the plan. Those are the four shoe boxes. The ones in the middle were closer to 30 square meters, and the ones at the sides were closer to 35 square meters. This is what a typical flat looked like. We restored one of the flats to exactly original condition. And it was an Airbnb flat, right? And that was João Ferreira, the art dealer. He was a tenant there for a while. And if I tell you the bed was behind the curtain, it was a bunk bed concealed behind João, behind the curtain. Basically, you would stow your kids away on the bunks behind the curtain. There'd be a double bed in the middle of the room where the parents slept. And, that was enough privacy, right? Okay? So, and that was the view, of course. So, I mean, you're prepared to forgive living in 30 to 35 square meters if that's your open space, that's your garden, I mean, it was a life. But 1938, like their equivalent of COVID happened, World War II happened, and you can imagine the Airbnb enterprise kind of fell apart, and it just mellowed into ordinary bachelor flats, and mellowed into a kind of a low-rent slum for 50, 60, 70, 80 years until I moved in there because it was cheap enough. And today it's probably 50-50 residential, long-term, short-term res, and I think that's probably the best mix for these kinds of blocks of flats, a good 50-50 mix. One of my first projects, important projects when I was at Louis Carroll as like a teenage architect, was the conversion of the Mutual building in Darling Street into 178 units. And why did we think of this? Because the whole of the centre of Cape Town was going the way of Joburg CBD. Buildings were being mothballed. Old Mutual building, that used to be the headquarters of Old Mutual, was mothballed. And then Cartwright's Corner, you can see in the background, was also about to be mothballed. It was all over the paper. Around about the year 2000, Cape Town was heading south, like Joburg CBD. And I was in Holyrood, desperately trying to buy my first bachelor flat, and they were so well held, nobody wanted to sell me one. And so we had this idea, surely you can carve this building up. So we did a speculative scheme, slicing the Old Mutual building up into bachelor flats, and we went to Old Mutual, who were just they didn't know what to do with this building. It was costing them more in rates each year than any income they could hope to get for it. So we found them an exit strategy to divide those flats up. Of course, they weren't all miserable studios. There was a penthouse at the top, which was 15 meters tall, which was incidentally just sold to a fashion designer from Johannesburg who's going to run her couturier from this 15-meter high living room. That was me as a child. And that was probably one of the best showers in Cape Town, with the cheapest taps. Those were not from Flash. And we really got into the sort of futurist aesthetic in Sea Point with, it was a big Louis Carroll project for Berman Brothers. I don't know if anybody remembers how bad that Checkers Galleria was, the Galleria in Sea Point. So basically made it a functional shopping center again. And again, just inspired by trains, planes, automobiles, and trying to be excited about the technologies that exist and the modern technologies that exist, and to try and make an architecture that is optimistic about modernism as opposed to pretending we are somewhere else or living in a different time. Another big project still in one of my last projects at Louis Carroll was this burnt-out tower in the center of Lusaka, where again, brutalist or sort of pure modernism has never really excited me. And essentially, as a firm, we are into the decorative arts. And we believe that that's missing from architecture. And we believe that if architects are to find their traditional roots of decorative artists, you've got to go back to the last great decorative movement, which was Futurism and Art Deco, and retrace your steps back to a time when people were excited about the future. So we found a copper-colored glass that's only produced in one province of China, and in fact, this was a $100 million project. It was so important, the clients flew us to China to find the glass, and we went to the province where they mine this pink glass. And we did so many tests, indoors, outdoors, different weather conditions, and this is a glass that only really shines on the equator, because if it were in Cape Town, it would just reflect blue sky and it would look black. But if it's where it's cloudy all the time, where the sun hardly ever shines, it's so dense with humidity, you get this incredible liquid gold, copper sheen on it. And then this was the last project at Louis Carroll, was for Chevron, where we tricked them into doing an industrial building. Oil companies don't want to look like oil companies. They call this they call this upstream. This is where the oil comes from, and they want to look downstream, which is where you sell it by retail. So we tricked Chevron into doing an upstream industrial building that tells the truth about, what an energy company is. They mine. And they sell petrol. And we believe there's beauty in that. And you don't have to hide these things. We like that buildings are expressive of their guts and their innards. So obviously, big fan of the postmodern high-tech work by Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers in London. That's Chevron had a very sophisticated sun screening system as well, all made out of white concrete. The white concrete only sells in small bags like sugar. It's very expensive. 2015, we went on our own, Robert McGivern, Alex Gee, and myself, and we started Robert Silke and Partners, and one of our first projects was to finish the Citadel building that Louis Carroll had started with us in Claremont, where we had two separate clients. One wanted a traditional stone Ivy League kind of building, and the other wanted a modern aluminium building. And me being the child of a divorce, one of my skills is running between parents and effecting a compromise. So we ended up with a futuristically undulating and curvaceous building made of granite. And everybody was happy. There was a risk that nobody would be happy, but everybody was happy. And it's a bank, and we thoroughly believe that banks need to spend their money. I don't think it's controversial that a bank should have a lavish head office, because the alternative, I can tell you, is not that it goes back to you. Okay, okay, that's not the alternative. The alternative is it gets distributed. We've always, one of the most important things I learned from Louis Carroll is that companies with money have a duty to spend that money in the economy, and if it makes the street environment more beautiful and it contributes to the built environment, that's a good thing for everybody. And if people get paid for doing so, and if artists and artisans get paid extra for doing so, that's the only shot any of us get of ever seeing corporate money. So this was all about marble and brass, and everything was solid. There's no fake stuff in here. I can tell you that reception desk is not Max on top. Okay, that is solid copper. We've done more work in Zambia as well, which is so. Just as a contrast, this is a building that's virtually made of mud and the stone that you find in the area, and that local workers can actually mine and hew that stone and carve it into those pieces and place it themselves. So that's a stark contrast to Citadel. We, as a practice, are very interested in cutting our suits to fit the cloth, right? There's no shame in a cheap building. There's no shame in a 3-star hotel. And we can be just as excited about doing a 5-star building for a bank by doing a 3-star building for what's effectively an affordable hotel with a convention center. This was the bar. Interesting, there's a lot of debate about colonialism at the moment. You go to a country like Zambia, which is 50 years after colonialism, all they want are gentlemen's clubs in Zambia. So literally the public areas, the bar, the restaurant are called the Copper Club in Zambia, and it's an approximation of what people imagine a gentleman's club would have been had all Zambians been able to go to one. That's the pizza oven made of solid copper as well, which I don't know if Stefan Antoni's here yet, but that's a little nod to that famous copper pizza oven that he put into Balducci's in Cape Town in the 1990s. Our first major project for Signatura was the conversion of a fake international style building on the foreshore, where my first ever job was in this building. It was a black glass box, and it was an approximation of what was going on in New York and Chicago 30 years before. And that's how long it takes for a new style to get to Cape Town, particularly during the latter half of the 20th century. It was a building so austere that Louis Carroll told the story that he fired the designer after this building was completed because the client said it looked like a coffin. And when it had to be, when it came to Nedbank converting it into apartments with Signatura, Signatura's big concern was, will people want to live in such an austere office building? And the truth is they won't. And what can we do to give this over-serious building? And that was a thing that was written about by architects at the time that the Herengracht was being built, is that the Herengracht was too modern, too serious, too austere for Cape Town. Cape Town is a cheerful, cheap, happy, luxurious, seaside holiday town. Sailors and whores, wealthy holidaymakers. That's essentially what Cape Town is about. And we have a kind of a frivolous, plaster and paint, colorful, curvaceous, luxurious architecture here. And what were we doing in the 1960s? Building these austere, soulless, rectangular cubes, one after the other, as if we were somewhere in Eastern Europe, right? And architects were talking about this at the time. There were grave reservations about what was going on in the Herengracht, this kind of modernist asceticism and austerity. And Signatura, who the most enlightened clients we've had, they saw this problem and they wanted something that spoke to the yachts and the cruise ships and the joy of living by the sea and by the harbor. And I've never had a client say this before. If you have to spend a few extra million on this facade, please just make it look like a place where people are happy living. And it was the most incredible opportunity to do something that is purely in steel and aluminium grafted onto that facade and kind of marries together, if you were to talk Chicago metaphors, the work by Mies in Chicago that the original building was hankering after, obviously, with the more curvaceous and humanistic work of Bertrand Goldberg, the Corncob Towers, also in Chicago, which sit side by side Mies's building. Incidentally, Bertrand and Mies were both at the Bauhaus together, but Bertrand, because he was Jewish, he had to flee the Bauhaus in 1936, headed back to Chicago, ran for his life, and Mies shortly followed him, and the two of them practiced separately, but virtually next to each other in Chicago for the rest of their careers, doing totally different kinds of buildings. So we kind of grafted the two schools of modernism together, something more flowing, futuristic, decorative, and just optimistic about a life in the center of Cape Town, by the sea. And the penthouses, they were conceived as like the top deck on a cruise ship, and really, when you're up there, all you see is the sea. And then there's Tuinhuis. Tuinhuis was a project which was our personal, paean ode to Holyrood in Queen Victoria Street, built basically one block away in Kerom Street. An updated idea, whereas Holyrood was perfectly symmetrical, Tuinhuis was completely asymmetrical. Probably owes more to Mendelssohn's Einstein Tower in Germany pre-war than it does to Art Deco or Holyrood even. And we delighted in using the cheapest of materials in order to create architecture. There's not a finish in here that cost more. I mean, the granite was probably 350 Rand a square meter, because at the time nobody wanted to use Sardo, so it was cheap. And those subway tiles were at a time when you could still get them for 150 Rand a square meter. And we did flats that were as small as 25 square meter studios, again for Airbnb. And some of them looked into light wells. But it's amazing, when you put a shape on a window, it doesn't really matter anymore what the view is. You could probably just frost that glass, it wouldn't matter. And that's something, again, that was lost from traditional architecture. Those buildings, nobody cared about views until 1950, really. People cared about the quality of space you had. Views are a very, very new obsession, and it's maybe a luxury we need to get over, that if the views allow us to be lazy, you just need a sheet of glass with a view, whereas if you don't have a view, you've actually got to spend some time on the architecture of the building. It's another way in which, as we were talking about earlier, that Cape Town gets away with third-rate buildings because of our first-rate natural environment. This is more of the 25 square meter micro unit, micro kitchen, micro bathroom. But of course there were penthouses on top, but Vizzy called this a micro penthouse because it was only 80 square meters. And of course penthouses get views, and penthouses get fancier finishes. And you can see you can see the Mayo champagne from Flush in there. Word for our sponsors. And it's a building that rather irreverently slots into the old and very, very varied, jagged fabric of inner city Cape Town. This is an image that very clearly shows that while there are buildings and environments in Cape Town that are precious, Cape Town is by no means a perfect environment that you want to set in stone right now, set it in time and never change another thing because it works just so perfectly. There's lots of room for improvement in Cape Town. So one must be very, very careful that when one is interested in conservation, that one doesn't confuse that with conservatism, because so often conservation is used as a cloak for political conservatism. That's Tannhaus poking its head out. This is David Southwood, who described the building as Bender, the beer-guzzling robot from Futurama, about to eat the beer house on Long Street. But yeah, I think there's room for a palimpsest of all kinds of buildings in all kinds of styles in the center of the city. New buildings don't have to defer. They don't have to they don't have to pretend to be invisible. I think we're doing ourselves out of a lot of opportunities to this obsession with making our new buildings invisible. They must stand proud, but obviously we must work a bit harder on them. You know, very few lecturers when I was studying were interested in what buildings looked like. In fact, it was a swear word. It was only Piet de Beer who used to say at the end of a crit, he said, "Rob, just make a nice elevation, okay?" You hardly ever heard that, and it's just so important. The only house we have ever done is a 216 Ocean View Drive, and I believe David Cohen is here today, and you'll probably be hearing from him later. He'll have his own slot later. David Cohen's the MD of Signatura. This is the house, and the only reason we did this was because he was the MD of Signatura. We would never have done a house otherwise. Houses are very, very hard work. For architects doing houses, we've avoided them our whole lives, because the client on a house is not the same as a client on a government project. It's not the same as a client on a commercial building. There's a lot more freedom on large-scale projects. On a house, your client is the architect, actually. You only had to watch, remember that show, Top Billing? You hardly ever saw the architect on those shows. The clients they reckon they designed those buildings, and they probably did. You know, very hands-on a residential client. Fortunately, with this house in Ocean View Drive, again, client was a kindred spirit, hey? And you know, there's nothing better than a client who comes to you for what you're selling, rather than having to take them on the journey. You know, when they come to, you know, if a client finds you, then you're going to have a good relationship because they were looking for you. Whereas if you've had to, like, I don't know, run to Sapoa and chase after potential clients in the toilets and beg them for a job, they don't know anything about you. And even if they give you a job, they don't know who you are, and you don't even know they'll like what they're going to show you. But when a client comes to you and they like what you're selling, then it's a beautiful relationship. And so this was a situation where, you know, the couple who built this house, they met in Tel Aviv in the White City there, you know, and the White City was built by Jewish refugee architects from the Bauhaus, who also had to leave in 1936 when the Nazis closed down the Bauhaus. And they came to Tel Aviv and they built whole districts in white plastic, dare I say, decorative modernism. And the clients had some of the best years of their life living in Tel Aviv in the White City, and were very happy to play a game around Tel Aviv Bauhaus at the top of Sea Point in Freyne. You can see the house is very introverted from the outside and extroverted from the inside, which really reflected the personality of the clients. And you can see no gold on the taps, no fur on the handrails, everything, you know, a lot of things were just made out of because the client was a property developer, he has supreme confidence in the kit of parts that all of his developments are made out of. So he didn't want anything more than the same aluminium window that goes in every other commercial development they do. He wanted the same plaster and paint, and wanted to make, so all we had to play with was the form. We took the standard kit of parts, your standard aluminium sections, didn't try to get glass that was too big or super clear, or go for materials that you can't get and need to import, etc., etc. The same ordinary kit of parts that you'd find in any development was put into this house, but the freedom one had was in the design. You take those standard elements and you make them overwrought to the point of opera. This was inside. Again, you can see very simple. All the builders had to do was get the walls straight. That's easy, right? Yeah. And you can see we built, there were some established plants we had to build the house around, and you'll see on the right-hand side, that window kind of looks like a terrarium. You can imagine, you know, squirrels burrowing and mating through the glass there, and orangutans, you know. It's like there could be wildlife in there. And then a very simple stair leading to the upstairs, with a Mobius strip for a balustrade. Again, dead simple. Hey, we don't play with finishes, we just play with form. and your obligatory Freyne panic door, which we decided to make look heavier and nastier than it needed to. You know, you can make them disappear, but why do that? You know, it's far more beautiful and interesting when things look the way they are and they tell the story of what they are. That curve you saw on the streets on the main corner, that was the guest shower. Again, it's a cathedral of a shower with a pretty standard tile and a slightly above average cost set of taps, again from Flush, I believe, from Flush, yeah. And while the site was not a view site, and the clients, you know, like good old-fashioned clients, they didn't care a damn about the view, but it just so happened that on first floor you got a view for free. And, you know, we're not into glass balustrades or steel balustrades or whatever. And by the way, if you look straight down, there's nothing to see. You're not missing anything, you know, in that glass balustrade. What you want to see is still very, very well visible. And they've got a roof garden going on the top where they grow their vegetables. And then, just in time for COVID, we finished a new hotel. It opened its doors. It opens its doors December 2020. And this was a new chain, an American chain of hotels that was experimenting with the idea of 18 square meter rooms with king-size beds. Okay? Figure how that works. But again, it was a kindred spirit of a client. You know, the really nasty clients, they don't really come to us. You know, they run a mile. So a lot of people ask me, where do I meet these people? And really, they find us. You know, I don't go hanging out at the toilets at Sapoa like other architects. Sorry. You know, they come to us, and so there's a lot of work we don't get, right? But that's okay. So these people, out-of-towners, they wanted to own, they had a site for a cottage in Greenpoint. They wanted to own an 80-room hotel on Greenpoint Main Road. They didn't have zoning. They didn't have heritage permission. Took us 5 years to get through everything. And they just wanted 80 rooms, 18 square meters. They wanted a pool on the top so big you'd be able to see it from the waterfront that lights up at night. You don't get this kind of brief from a South African hotelier, I can tell you. That was the hotel on completion. That's looking up through the fisheye holes in the bottom of the pool. That's the main entrance. We've got a bit of curved glass in there. That's the bar, opening out into the street. That's reception. That's me in the lift. The corridors were 1.1 meter wide. It's basically like a submarine. And then this was the 18 square meter room. The budget was so low, we wanted Michael Chandler to draw the wallpaper for us. It's Cara Saven wallpaper. We wanted Michael Chandler to draw the design. There was no money for that, so we drew it ourselves. So it's literally all part of the architectural service. That's the bathroom. So all in 18 square meters. That's your king-size bed in 18 square meters. And then they wanted an art gallery on the top. Every architect wants to design an art gallery. So it's just, yeah, this amazing brief. And then also in 2020, we had a baby and moved out of the futurist house in Holyrood. And my entire life, I've been working against face brick buildings. I've been running away from face brick. And actually, my entire life, I've been running away from Pinelands. It's really, I'm a committed urbanist, and I ended up in a face brick house in Pinelands. But believe it or not, this is a futurist house. You want to know why? It was built in 1938 by same architects who did UCT, also in the 30s, Walgate and Ellsworth, Captain Ellsworth. And it was built again in the eve of World War II as a model home for Pinelands. They set up a brick factory in Kales River, and they set up a roof tile factory in Kales River, and this was the show house. So it's got the steepest pitched roof you've ever seen to show off all of the good extruded clay products. Right, it's the best advantage. And as the house was finished, war broke out, and they never sold a single roof tile, and they never sold a single brick, and the brick factory closed down, and all that's left of the entire enterprise was this one house with the most remarkable bricks you've ever seen. You'd swear that, you know, the legend in Pinelands is that an English aristocrat imported the house lock, stock, and barrel from England and rebuilt it here using English bricks and English labourers. It's all nonsense. It was all made in Cape Town in Kales River and put together by South Africans. I don't know what contractor you would use to put that brickwork together, and who would know what brick goes where. That's the front door. Who made those bricks in Kales River, and how did the builder know exactly where those, and did the architect draw every brick? You know, that's Milo, my cat. So whereas the outside of the house was this late arts and crafts revival, the inside was modern, because it was 1938. So this was the model home of the future in 1938, and we just restored it back to its Art Deco original interior. Those are the original tiles. That is the original bathroom. Luckily, those vinyl tiles, barely by the skin of their teeth, Marley are still making them in Pietermaritzburg. Catch them while you can. And the house was so neglected that nobody had messed it up. So it was possible to restore it without changing a thing. Another COVID project is Signatura saw we were bored and desperate during lockdown, and they also were looking for something to do. And what do you do in the middle of a depression? You know, all the other pipelines had closed up. So the brief was to do depression-era holiday apartments. Basically, the brief for Holyrood again. A block for Airbnb, done at 25 square meters per unit. So these are 72 units that are roughly 25 square meters each. No parking, absolutely unnecessary. And what a difference it makes when the architect is liberated from the burden of having to design around parking. You want to know why all our buildings look like high-rise parking garages? Because that's what they are. We are in the business of building parking garages. We design the parking grid first, and the flats just have to fit in with that. We try and avoid transfer beams. We try and avoid any kind of shaping. Also, it's not so easy to shape a building on Revit. You know, it's not on the drop-down menu, those shapes. Okay? Hey, I think we know that. So here's a building that, because it didn't have to rely on a parking grid, you could crank the flats at 45 degrees to where the view was. And you could curve them, and you could be totally liberated. You could go back to a time that hadn't been seen in the 20s or the 30s, that architects could design large buildings without worrying about parking. And the fact is, nobody needs it. Not in these kinds of flats, not in a desirable urban environment like Cape Town, which is walkable. You can work there, you can live there without having to get in a car. You are liberated when you're living in Sea Point Main Road, and that's why virtually every block in Sea Point is being redeveloped right now, okay? In 5 years' time, Regent Road and Main Road will be unrecognizable, and I can tell you, they're not all bad buildings. Okay? They're not all high-rise parking garages. There's now, since Flamingo and since, Signatura took a bet on us, every developer is trying to up their game on design standards, particularly on Sea Point Main Road and in Regent Road. And there are some very interesting projects that we did not do, okay, that are going to be coming up as well. So this was Flamingo, and it's essentially for Airbnb, though I suspect if you check back in 5 years' time, it'll probably be 50-50 long-term residential, 50% Airbnb, and I think that's the good mix. If it's 100% Airbnb, there's an unbalance. If it's 100% long-term rentals, there's also unbalanced. 50-50, I think that's a good mix for Cape Town. And then this is what a typical floor looked like. Again, you've got these identical 25 square meter pods, but it had the station house directly across the road, which was very tall and big and got in the way of the view. So we could just crank the building so it turns its cheek and it faces Lion's Head. And every flat there, 25 square meters. It's got its own couch, it's got its own bed. I don't call these micro apartments. I don't like the word micro apartment. To me, the definition of a micro apartment is if you have to start using technology to solve the architectural problems. For example, a fold-out bed. To my mind, you've lost. If you have to fold out the bed, you've lost. The flat can be small, but you have to be able to choose your own furniture like a grown-up and furnish the flat yourself. There has to be place for a real bed, a real couch, real sideboard. It can't all just be built in, because that means it's just too small. So those are the silos. Where it faces the buildings, we don't want to see. The building looks almost as if it has no windows at all. We had to put in air conditioners as a last-minute design brief change. So we found this air conditioner that has no external condenser unit. You can imagine what that would have looked like. And it just has these two little spots, these two little pimples, which we made black. Again, it's tempting to hide them, but if you can turn them into a beauty spot, why not make them black and place them nicely? This is how we modeled what that pod apartment would look like. And this is what the access galleries look like, good old-fashioned Depression-era access galleries with a screeded strip paint floor and open air, and you don't have to have an extractor fan in your bathroom. You can actually open a window, have natural ventilation through your flat like an old-fashioned apartment, and that's how they actually came out. This is Paris Brummer, who's photographing today. And that's how every flat, even on the lowest floors, catches the view of Lion's Head, because it turned the cheek at 45 degrees, because you didn't have to worry about putting parking underneath. That's the pod bathroom. There's the pod bathroom. That's a balcony facing the sea. And our one little architectural flourish was glass blocks on the fire escape, because, the light has to always be on in the fire escape. So it's like free neon signage. It's performing two functions at once. It is the sign of the building, and it's also the fire escape. Glass blocks give you that. And did you know that glass blocks are 2-hour fire rated? Think about that. This is another futurist project in Claremont, 2-bedroom flats that are just started construction next to Kingsbury Hospital. This is called Crescent Road. Spindle is a new tower that's currently on the market in the center of town, in the cultural core by Church Street, Church Square. And these are larger flats. So just in case you think everything is micro flats, it's not anymore. This is the penthouse at the top. That's the penthouse looking out over the skyscrapers of the city. Very important new project, also looking at for Signatura, is Tropicana. It's a sister. When I say sister, not a twin sister, a sibling sister to Flamingo. So if you see on our hand sketch, you've got Flamingo on the right, you've got the old fire station in the middle with Queen Victoria in front, and in the background, that's Tropicana, the sibling to Flamingo. This is looking down Kloof Road. It's where that old, it was a vet, it was an estate agency, it was Romeo's brothel, you'll remember. That white-painted little house behind the fire station. And this is what it's going to be. It is another Airbnb apartment hotel. It's more a hotel than an apartment building. And this is one that's so good, Signatura is going to hold it and keep it. I'm sure David's going to speak a little bit more about it later. But there's a Tushers who are booked, signed up for downstairs. So this is directly across the road from Sunny and Irene. And here, it's small studios, 1-bedroom flats, and you won't be able to buy here, but you will be able to stay here. And to me, this is Sea Point. It's the style modern, it's the Art Deco, it's the futurist modernism, and it's the seaside fantasy. Small units, though. Also for so just in case you think that all development now is about micro apartments, and that we're all going to be living out Kurt Schwab from the World Bank's from the IMF's rather dire prediction, where he said optimistically, one day none of us will own anything and we will be happy. What he was basically saying is, if you're living in cities in the West, you're going to live in a micro apartment and you're going to eat bugs and you're going to say thank you. But not every development is about micro flats. It was, I'd say, a function about the last few years. A, there's demand for hotel rooms in Cape Town. B, COVID just meant that nobody could really spend more than $1 million to $1.5 million on an apartment. But Signatura has launched a new city in the Garden Route in George called Arbor Estate, which is 100 houses and 100 flats which are going to be launched. 3-bedroomed houses, livable houses, and 2-bedroom, highly livable apartments set in a jungle in George. It's cleared environmental clearance, a lot of hoops been jumped through. It's a 10-hectare site. We're only allowed to develop 4 hectares. There's a river, there's a forest, and we're doing a modernist, futurist city set in a forest. It's an absolute dream, and there will be a life to be had there where you go back to the nostalgia of having your own house, freestanding, your own garden, a clubhouse with a giant pool, and water slides, and dog parks for small dogs, and dog parks for big dogs. And it's basically, I mean, if you can think of people from Johannesburg who are wanting to move down to the Western Cape, because that's a thing, hey? That really, I mean, I don't have to tell everybody about it. And you don't want to live in a micro flat and eat bugs. You come to George, and for the same price, you can live the life to which you have been accustomed. So even the apartments, so the smallest apartments are 60 square meter, 2-bedroom flats, all with balconies, all with braais, all with all of this land and forest and river around it. And, I would say we can be optimistic in that there are utopias planned here in South Africa for the future. It's not all doom and gloom, and it's not all micro flats. And even, in Cape Town, if you're still in the market for a 250 square meter, 4-bedroomed house in Fernwood, we're doing townhouses in Fernwood. It's a big thing. Again, also for the Joburg market, if they've got 13 million to spend, you can get a 4-bedroom townhouse in the shadow of Table Mountain. This is the row of the 5. And if architects are the canaries for the economy, I can tell you that the trends for Cape Town are good. I know a lot of people are still down about, the economy and the Cape economy. Things are looking up. The inquiries are up. People are moving down here. People are spending money. Developers are developing. Schemes are going into council. It's going to be okay here. And for those people who wonder, is it sustainable that Cape Town can do so well if the rest of the country is doing so badly? It's the story of development, and it's the story of civilizations, that certain cities win and other cities lose. London by far outranks any other city in the UK. There are provincial backwaters with no economy compared to London. The economy of London could be as large as the rest of the cities in the UK combined if you put them together. That's the story. There's always one city that there's a Pareto distribution in cities where 80% of the wealth and investment will go to 20% of the urban areas. And we just happen to be in it right now, and we are very, very lucky. It is not only is it sustainable, but it is the direction that civilization follows. Very rarely is there a moment where Joburg used to be that city, and very rarely is there a moment that it switches to another city. A hell of a lot has to go wrong in one place and go right in the other place for that to happen, but it's happened. Joe Noero said this, and I've come to learn he was right, that Cape Town is probably the best place in the world to be an architect or a designer. Our skills are desperately needed. People need a lot of homes. They need a lot of apartments. We need a lot of hotels. Soon, they will need a lot of offices, and they will need a lot of shops. That will come later. Won't come immediately. But there's a future in Cape Town, and it's the most incredible natural setting to work in. And our skills as built environment professionals could not ever have been needed more. So you might be surprised that the future is better than what the newspapers say and what the news networks say and what you see overseas in the press about us. The news is better. And it harks back to what Peter Dirk Uys said about South Africa. In South Africa, the future is actually certain. It's the past that is unpredictable.